so much for being here today. We're super excited to have you. I would love if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Janine Bolon, and I started off as an analytical biochemist in the pharmaceutical industry, and I now own a podcasting and broadcasting company. And so we are on 47 internet platforms and 64 public radio stations. And so we run a concierge service. I also happen to be an author of 11 books. I'm now in negotiations for book 12 and 13. And yeah, I also kind of do the podcast gig, got 7 shows. And we also have that beautiful thing at the end of I'm also an online course creator, have been doing that since 2015. So I've got about 91 online courses. So that's kind of where I am.
Wow, that's so amazing. What are your books about?
I write to 4 different demographics. So I'm going to share with your readers the 4 books that they can get for free. I only ask for shipping and handling, and that way they can kind of get a taste and see if they want to do the rest of the series of books. So the first one is author podcasting, how to take your book on a virtual tour, how to be a standout guest. And I started that I wrote it in 2017 because I was so frustrated with the type of guests that I was getting on the show. Since 2020, things are much better, but still I request a media kit and you understand why we need those things. But so that's author podcasting. And that's for anybody who wants to take either their book or their business or their message into the podcasting arena. It's just a way of being considerate of the podcast host. So that's the first book. The second book is The Thriving Solopreneur. Again, this was published in 2019. And by 2020, I had huge outreach for that as people in MLM industries, as well as people that were being let go of jobs and had never run a business for themselves before. Really enjoyed that book on how to nurture your business in 4 hours a week. Then the third book is Ditch Your Debt While Banking Bucks. And that's the oldest running series. I have been writing and teaching on debt-free living since 1996. So that's my basic platform. And so what is the 60/40 principle? How do you live debt free? Do you pay off your debt? Do you save money? All those type of questions are answered in that book. And the final demographic is the Divine series. And that's where it's expressing the divine. It's a guidebook for the enlightened soul. And that's more the woo-woo crowd, as I lovingly say. Those are the psychic, mystics, shamans, energy workers, mediums, oracle readers, tarot card readers, all of that. The expressing the divine is a way of helping them move forward in their businesses. So that's kind of the 4 demographics.
Amazing. What inspired you to write books in those 4 demographics?
Always my readers. It started off with my students. I was a professor that was teaching mathematics and physics at a liberal arts college. And this is back in 2002 through 2005. And I was teaching to non-majors of those areas. And so I was basically doing like survey courses. And Ditch Your Debt While Banking Bucks, that one really came out because my students' grades dropped as they went through the course, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. It was because they didn't know how to budget. So they started living on ramen, Dinty stew, cup of noodles, and their nutrition was tanking. And therefore they did not have the nutrition they needed to get through finals because they didn't know how to budget. So that's where the 60/40 principle and those series of books came from. And every book that I've written since then has been because my readers or my students reached out and said, "Hey, Janine, would you write a book on blah, blah?" Or "I like your perspective on blah, blah." And so that's how it was always driven by my readers.
Amazing. When you were writing your books, this might not exactly pertain, but who are you thinking of when it comes to who your book is for? Was it based off the demographic? Did you narrow it down more, or did you just broaden?
When I write, there's always a single person in my head, and I write to that very single person. I started doing that with the very first book in 2005, which was Money, It's Not Just for Rich People. And in there, I had a very specific student I was writing to. And the student was working full time, had a family, and was going through a divorce and just and so I wrote specifically to that family member. And what was fascinating was how it niched down the books all on their own, so that it made it very, people would say, geez, Janine, when I read your book, I felt like you were just sitting across the table from me, having a cup of coffee, and you were talking to me. And that's how I've been able to keep that voice, has always been. I always write a book to a single person, and that niches the book all on its own.
That's so amazing. How long have you been writing and what made you really sit down and start?
So I was always told that I was a terrible writer. I have learned English three different ways. My father was in the Navy. And so every time we moved to another country, I learned a different version of English. I learned the British version of English. I've learned island English. I've learned the King's English. I've learned, different versions of English. And then I got to America. So it's a nightmare. And I was always told, oh my God, you don't write very well. So to get me to write really required um, a lot of push. And it started with my master's thesis in 2005. And that's where Money, It's Not Just for Rich People came from, was at the behest of not only my mentors, but also the students. They were like, you really need to write this book. At the time, the publishing houses wouldn't touch me because here I was, this physics professor at this little liberal arts college. I didn't have the authority. I didn't have a platform that they even wanted to look at. And so back then it was called vanity publishing. And so I went out and I published my own book, and people were like, yeah, well, it's not a real book, because you just this, that, and the other. But I was on this new platform called Amazon, and Amazon was just starting to take over from Barnes and Noble and all that kind of stuff. And because of that, and because I then had a YouTube channel, and a YouTube channel was like, wow, what's that? Because it really didn't kick into high gear until 2006. People thought, oh, well, I actually did have a platform. I actually was somebody that knew what they were talking about. But it took some time because vanity publishing was still very much a thing of, you're so vain that you're publishing your own work. It didn't have now everybody does it, right?
Yeah. What is your schedule like when you are writing a book?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because we're recording this right as we're finishing up October, and we have National Novel Writing Month come up. And for those who don't know what that is, NaNoWriMo, I got into in 2014 because my daughter in high school was like, "Mom, hey, you write books. There's this neat thing called NaNoWriMo," and I'm like, "But I'm a nonfiction writer. You're the one that writes the stories." She always wrote these amazing stories, and she's like, "But Mom, you're a rebel. You just wear your sunglasses to the meeting and they'll know that you're a nonfiction writer." I was like, oh my gosh. So this has been around since 1999. I didn't know anything about it. So what does my schedule look like? I write my books during the month of November. I totally clear off my schedule. I have very few meetings that I will attend. I don't get on podcasts. I don't, like, all of it shuts down because that's my creative month. And this month, this NaNoWriMo of 2022, I will be writing two books. I'll be writing book number 12 and 13 because the word count, I only need 15,000 words for the one book. And for the other book, I actually need 45,000. And so I'll be using NaNoWriMo to keep me on task. So what does that look like? I get up in the morning at 3:30. I have a cup of coffee and I sit down on my computer and I write until my very first meeting, which is usually somewhere around 7 a.m. And so at 7 a.m., I'll have my meeting. And so I write like that for 30 days straight. Now, if it isn't in the month of November and somebody has requested a book from me and they're paying me to write that book for them, uh, then I get up at pretty much at 3:30 every morning. And that's what it does. I work until 7 a.m. And yeah, so that's my routine.
I love that. That's very unique. What do you need in your writing space to help you stay focused?
Hmm. I've been writing for so long. I'm sorry, give me a minute. When I first started writing, I had 4 small children, and so that's why I would get up at 3:30 in the morning. The joke used to be, I'll get up at 3:30 and I write until the first kid wakes up, which was usually around 6 a.m., 5:36, depending upon what was going on. And so that used to be what would stop me. Well, now all my kids are out of the house, and so they're in college and that. And so now it's like my own schedule dictates when I stop. So to stay focused is I I don't have an issue if I start to struggle with a sentence or if something starts to cause me to stumble in my writing. I just turn on my music, and I can't have music that has lyrics. If somebody is singing, that messes up the creativity for me. I think it's because I'm actually a wordsmith, right? Authors are wordsmiths. So I can't have people saying words to me because that'll mess it up. But I have this minimalistic techno pop station that I listen to that keeps me totally focused. And when that music is going, I know I only have a certain amount of time to write. So I stay pretty focused. I have a lot of discipline, I guess. I've just never had that much difficulty staying on point when it came to writing because I knew I had a short period of time.
I love that. What is your favorite writing snack or drink?
Definitely hot cocoa. If I am progressing really well, I will have hot chocolate instead of coffee. So some people are like, "Ooh, well, hey, that's my little thing, right?" My favorite food is popcorn. I like having crunchy stuff. Now, as I've gotten older, because I'm over 55 now, I got to watch the carbs. So now I'm eating like salted almonds and stuff like that. I've gone more to the protein route than the carb route.
I love that. What type of books do you personally enjoy reading?
I absolutely love and thrive on science fiction. That is my fantasy place. But I have started because I'm a podcaster. I have a lot of authors that gift me their books, and so now I've started getting into self development because it just seems to be those are the authors that are reaching out to me, and so I'm reading a lot of self development, how to have a better mindset, and then always ever since I was very young I have always read business books because I'm always looking for the latest technique or the skill set because as a business owner you just have to constantly sharpen the saw, and so that's how I do it is through learning skills and techniques from other people. So I know that's kind of three different demographics, but I also then have what I call my bubblegum books, and those are candy for the mind. They have absolutely no use or purpose. They're just what some people would call pulp fiction. And that's when I read things like Batman and my Star Trek and Star Wars, any of those sorts of books. And people are like, "Oh my gosh, Janine, that's food for thought for me." I'm like, "Well, sorry, for me, those are my bubblegum books." But I love them because for me, I just sit and I read them, and they're just like chewing bubblegum for me.
Love that. Are there any books or authors that inspired you to become a writer?
I think one of the writers that most inspired me was Joseph Campbell. I really enjoyed I found out about him through myths that make us and that sort of thing. I didn't even know about the hero of a thousand faces until I joined NaNoWriMo in 2014. I'd been writing books long before then. But when I found out about the hero of a thousand faces, then I even dove even deeper into it. And then I happened to find um on PBS the interview series that he gave with Dan Rather, and that's when I enjoyed being able to read even more about his work. So Joseph Campbell was definitely one of those.
Amazing. What books did you grow up reading and did you have an all-time favorite?
I grew up reading a lot of science fiction because I found the current reality that I was on. So when I was in middle school and high school, it was transitioning from the 70s to the 80s. And it was a time where you had Cindy Lauper singing about being a material girl and those sort of things. Girls just want to have fun and all that kind of stuff. And it was what we called bubblegum music at the time because it was like it didn't have any substance. It wasn't a serious message like some of the Beatles music was getting, really serious and had a strong message. And it just was one of those eras where Star Wars had come out, and that just really fired me up as far as like, oh my gosh, finally, I wanted to get out in space. And it was a very technological. And so I loved a lot of the stuff that was Frank Herbert. I read a lot of Robert Heinlein. And the book that was my all-time favorite was from an author that kind of ran hot and cold, and that was Alan Dean Foster. I really loved his book Midworld, but I used to read an author, like I'd get every book I could of theirs and I would read it. But I found that he was really hot and cold. Some of his stuff was brilliant and some of it did not appeal to me at that moment that I was reading it. And so, but my all-time favorite was Midworld. And that was because that was a book that my father read and he really liked. And that was one of the few times I could sit down and just talk about books with my dad. He and I had a similar mindset for that book, but much of the rest of it, I couldn't really get into football and I really wasn't into the sports and I didn't like cars, but I could talk to my dad about science fiction. And so that's why Midworld will always have a very warm spot in my heart. And thank you, Alan Dean Foster, for writing that book.
I love that. On the other side of that, now as an adult, do you have any favorite series or authors that if something comes out, you're going to grab it?
Michael Reeves, he wrote something about Batman with fear. He wrote about the Scarecrow, and the Scarecrow was always my favorite villain for Batman. And so Michael Reeves wrote that book, and then the next one was Mr. Twilight, and he co-authored that with someone else. And I keep hounding him. I found his email through one of these other friends of mine. I keep hounding about when are you going to do the next Mr. Twilight? When are you going to do the next Mr. Twilight? And he keeps saying, I got other projects because he's a screenwriter as well. And so I'm like, dude, seriously, I love this series, but he hasn't revisited that. And then he had another book he co-authored with a author, and that was Inner World, I believe was it's called. And that's where he was a multidimensional jumper, and he had the multiverse kind of going on. So Michael Reeves is definitely the one I keep track of, just because he wrote a lot for the Star Wars franchise. So he's somebody that I definitely follow.
I love that. What would you tell someone just starting to read? Ugh, edit, Patrick. What would you tell someone just starting out with reading again?
I kind of need a clarifying question on that. Like, what age are they?
It could be more the adults or like late teens. They're just starting out to read again and they don't know where to start.
For teenagers, I highly recommend the Harry Potter series because it really starts them back in middle school and they have a really fresh remembrance of that traumatic event because middle school is so tough. And then high school, that's why I absolutely love the narrative that J.K. Rowling had. It was showing teenagers that you actually can make huge impact even though you may be in a horrific environment. And I really identified a lot with Harry Potter because college was a safe place for me. And I really loved being able to be at college. And I didn't want to go home because there was a lot of drama happening at home that I didn't identify with. So there you go. So that's what I would recommend for teenagers. But for the adults who are just getting back into reading again, I always ask them, well, what genre do you enjoy? I mean, do you like high drama? Do you like, it just depends on what you're involved in. And if you really like high drama, there's so much out there that's very well written. I wouldn't even begin to know where to start. But if you are very much interested in action and adventure, I absolutely love Lord of the Rings. I mean, I have, when that came out, I just absolutely adored it. But then I already gave you the other books I give. So if I find out they're kind of more into action heroes and they enjoy the DC universe and Marvel, I'll give them the Batman book that Michael Reeves wrote about Fear and Scarecrow, because that's incredibly well written and the depth of it is quite good. But then there's also the aspect of science fiction. I always recommend Midworld just because it was so near and dear to my heart. But then there's the whole Dune trilogy. And I call it the Dune trilogy, even though it's got way more books than that. But I encourage people to kind of stop with those three and digest what was said with that, and then before they move on to the next series of books. But there's a lot of new books that are floating around. And if you're into murder mysteries, I used to enjoy P.D. James, but now I really enjoy Helen Starbuck. And that's because she was an OR nurse and she writes these medical murder mysteries. And because I was in the pharmaceutical industry for so long, I absolutely adore her stuff. Her characters don't do crazy stuff. Like some writers don't understand certain conditions. So, like if one of her characters gets a concussion, she doesn't have them go running across a field, right? Because they've had a concussion. She knows that being vertical is going to be a challenge for them. So that's why I love her stuff. It's very accurate. She goes to great pains to be accurate.
I love that. On the other side of that, what would you tell someone just starting to write their own book?
Don't stop. If you're being prompted to write your book, there is a reader out there that needs what you're writing. And there's a lot of demons in your own head you're going to have to fight, but don't listen to them. If you're being inspired, if you think, somebody could learn from this, I wish somebody had written this book for me. I wish I had had this book. Realize that that's why you're being driven to write, is because it's your job to the rest of humanity. And I don't mean to scare anybody, but I'm going to poke you about this. You're being inspired to write that because there is somebody out there that's going to read that book and be transformed by it. I don't care if it's a novel. I don't care if it's something that's happening with a character, but what that character is going through is their life and they can identify with that character and they want to see how you're going to walk that character through that particular trauma or drama. And it's important to finish the bloody book.
I love that. So true, so true. What's one thing that people are generally surprised to find out about you?
That I have such varied interests and that they ask me, how can you do it all? And the answer is, well, I don't do it all the time. And I hire help. And I think that's one of the things is that when they really start diving into my life and what I'm involved in and what I'm doing, they were like, oh my God, just looking at your life is exhausting to me. And for me, it's like looking at my life, it's like, I wish I had more hours in the day because I do even more. I absolutely love my life. I love the way I have it set up and the way I'm walking my particular journey. And I just find it interesting that the more I do, the more energy I get and the more creative I become. And the more creative I become, the more people I have to hire because I have so many ideas. And that is, I think, the biggest thing that causes people to be surprised.
I love that. Is there anything you would like to say or add?
To anyone who might be listening to this, if you have ever been asked by somebody, you should write a book on that, then I encourage you to just write a chapter and find somebody who's doing a compilation book or something like that and get your chapter out there. It's less scary to write a chapter where you only need to write 1,800 to 2,000 words for a chapter. That's so much easier for you to do than to write a whole book. So start off with a chapter. And there are so many people out and about that are doing compilation books. And get into a compilation book. And then after you have that book, that'll give you some momentum and then start writing a couple of chapters or maybe a short story or what have you. Don't worry about doing it the right way. One of the things I've learned after I have interviewed over 99 different authors, there is no one right way. I have heard the whole gamut, and I hope that you have listened to Courtney, you have listened to this podcast, you realize there is no one right way to do all these things. Just get the words down on your document and get it into a PDF file so that somebody else can read it.
So true. And if you have listened to other episodes, you'll see that everyone answers the questions differently.
It's quite right. There's no one right way, but there is your way. So get on it, do it your way.
Love that. Where's the best place for readers to find your books? I know some readers love signed copies. Is that an option and the best place to connect with you?
Yes, there is a way to get signed copies, and you can do that if you go to authorpodcasting.com or you can go to janinebolon.com, and that may be a little difficult to find. If you truly are struggling to find me, you can go on to LinkedIn and look up Janine Bolon, and it's spelled colon only with a B. Yes, unfortunate, but true. And the best way to connect with me is, yes, through LinkedIn, or you can just go to my parent company website, which is the8gates.com and /open Friday coffee. Because if you go to that link, then you can actually come on to a Zoom room. I would love to get to know you. I'd love to hear that. Yes, I listen to Courtney's stuff all the time. She's great. She's got this amazing podcast. I highly recommend that you listen to it. It's quality content, especially if you have a message you want to share with the world. Listen to what Courtney's talking to, listen to who she's talking to, and how they're asking you to keep your message rocking and rolling. But anyway, come on to my Open Friday coffee. It's relaxed. Love to get to know you better.
I love that. Well, thank you so, so much for being here today. It was amazing to get to have you on the show. We'll be sure to drop links in the show notes so that everyone can find you easier. And again, thank you so much.
I really appreciate you inviting me, and you just keep your podcast rolling. It's important that you're out there.